The night was quiet, but not peaceful. Imagine the kind of silence that doesn't comfort you, it stalks you. The kind that makes every flicker of a streetlight feel like a warning, every shadow on wet pavement stretched too long, too sharp. That's where this story begins. An empty Alabama highway, the hour when most men are asleep, and one woman is about to be thrown into a nightmare that will test not just her resolve but the illusion of justice itself. Her name is Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson, Navy officer, veteran, a woman who's stared down storms at sea, who's trained for combat, who's survived interrogations in hostile lands, but none of that prepared her for the enemy that wore a badge on home soil. Red and blue lights ignited behind her like a predator's eyes. She slowed, pulled over, hands steady on the wheel. She knew the ritual: license, registration, composure. But rituals don't protect you when the man behind the badge has already decided you're guilty of something, anything, simply because you are a black woman on the wrong road at the wrong time. Sergeant Daniel Briggs. His boots hit the pavement with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. He leaned into her window, flashlight slicing across her face like she was prey. No greeting, no explanation, just orders. And when she questioned him, not with anger, not with defiance, but with the calm precision of someone who knows the law, his smirk cracked into something darker. That's how it starts. Not with a gunshot, not with flashing headlines, with the small humiliations, the casual abuse of power, the tightening of handcuffs that cut into skin like shackles, with a voice that sneers, "Because I said so," and a woman forced into the back of a patrol car for daring to ask why. What Briggs didn't know, what he couldn't possibly fathom, was that he had chosen the wrong woman, because Renee Dawson wasn't another silent statistic. She wasn't going to vanish into paperwork or disappear into a holding cell without consequence. She had the kind of resolve that shatters careers, the kind of truth that can bring whole systems crashing down. And by the time the sun rose, Briggs would learn what every tyrant eventually learns. Power is only untouchable until the right person decides to touch it back. The back seat of a patrol car is designed to break you down. Hard plastic digging into your spine, no room to move, no way to rest your hands without the cuffs burning into your skin. Renee sat there, breathing slow, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her crack. Briggs strutted to his seat, whistling like this was just another routine stop, another notch on his belt of intimidation. But the truth? He was playing a dangerous game he couldn't control. He pulled back onto the highway, lights still flashing, painting the night in red and blue. "Most people," he said, his voice dripping with smugness, "they don't argue with me. They just do what they're told." He glanced into the rearview mirror, trying to catch her eyes. She gave him nothing but silence. He hated that. Silence can be louder than words, especially when it comes from someone who isn't afraid. "You think you're somebody, huh?" Briggs muttered, his knuckles tightening around the wheel. "Military? Above the law? Bet you thought I'd back down." He wanted her small. He wanted her begging. But Renee knew the psychology of men like him. Men who confuse obedience with respect, who mistake fear for power. The more she held her ground, the more his mask began to slip. The station loomed ahead, a squat block of concrete and glass. Briggs pulled in fast, braking sharp like he wanted her to feel the jolt. He got out first, slamming his door harder than he needed to, then he yanked hers open. "Let's go." His grip was too tight on her arm, a warning disguised as authority. Inside, the stench of stale coffee and disinfectant hung in the air. Paperwork shuffled. A desk sergeant barely looked up. This wasn't just negligence, it was complicity. Every officer who ignored, who looked the other way, gave men like Briggs the green light to operate unchecked. That's the secret no one tells you. Tyranny doesn't always roar. Sometimes it yawns, stamps a paper, and goes back to scrolling a phone. When the cell door clanged shut behind her, Renee sat on the cold steel bench and exhaled. She wasn't broken. She wasn't even shaken. She was planning. And that's where Briggs made his first mistake. He thought he'd silenced her. But silence, in the hands of the right person, is just the gathering of a storm. Briggs came back, arms folded, his smirk plastered across the bars like a man who thought he owned the very air she breathed. "Comfy?" he asked, leaning in just enough for his breath to carry through the steel. Renee didn't move, didn't blink. Her stillness made him uneasy. Men like Briggs thrive on reaction, on fear. Take that away and you strip them bare. "You know," he continued, voice low, "if you'd just played along, you wouldn't be in here." His eyes searched for weakness, a crack in her armor. Renee tilted her head, allowed the faintest smile to touch her lips. "Oh," she said softly, "I'm exactly where I need to be." That rattled him. For a split second, the mask slipped. His smirk faltered, and behind it was something raw. Uncertainty. He covered it fast, scoffing, pacing, whispering threats about teaching her a lesson. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. Then, footsteps. Another officer appeared, younger, clipboard in hand, voice hesitant. "Sergeant, you might want to see this." Briggs turned, annoyed. The kid shifted nervously. "We got a call, a lawyer. Higher-ups asking why she's being held." For the first time that night, Briggs's confidence cracked. His jaw tightened, words spilling out in a mutter too low for her to catch. He stormed down the hallway, fists clenched, the weight of someone else's authority pressing against his back. Renee leaned against the cold wall of her cell, letting the silence settle again. She had been through worse. She had been in rooms overseas where every breath was a gamble, where every word could mean life or death. Compared to that, this was a waiting game. And she knew something Briggs didn't. When you think you're untouchable, you never prepare for the day you're touched. The echo of Briggs's boots returned. He appeared, eyes burning, voice sharp. "What the hell did you do?" Renee looked at him calmly. "I didn't do anything," she said, her tone slicing the air with precision. "But people talk, and some of us," she leaned forward, locking her gaze on his, "have friends in very high places." That was the moment it shifted. Power drained from his posture. His arrogance didn't vanish, it curdled into fear. And fear makes desperate men sloppy. Renee knew then. His downfall had already begun. Morning light spilled across polished wooden floors, cutting through the chill of the courthouse like a blade. The air was tense, electric, the kind that makes every cough, every shuffle of paper feel amplified. Renee stood at the defendant's table, not in handcuffs, not in chains, but in a sharp navy blazer, her presence radiating control. Beside her, attorney Carla Whitman sifted through files like a surgeon preparing instruments. Efficient, ruthless, exactly what this war required. At the back, the heavy wooden doors opened. Briggs walked in, same squared shoulders, same cocky tilt of his chin, but his stride wasn't as fluid anymore. His eyes betrayed the truth. He wasn't walking into his kingdom. He was walking into a battlefield where the rules weren't written by him. The judge entered, gavel striking once, silencing the room. Judge Alan Kirkland, older, weary, a man who had seen too much arrogance in too many uniforms. His glasses slid down the bridge of his nose as he glanced over the files. "Let's get to it," he sighed. The prosecutor rose, calm, precise. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, Sergeant Daniel Briggs has a documented pattern of misconduct." The words cut the air like a razor. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Briggs shifted, jaw tightening, hands clenched into fists. He leaned forward, growling. She was uncooperative during a routine stop. The prosecutor didn't flinch. He raised a document high. "Uncooperative? This woman's record shows a distinguished military career. graduate of the Naval Academy, commendations, 0 criminal history, no outstanding citations. Are you telling this court she was such a threat you had to arrest her over a broken tail light? The silence that followed was crushing. Briggs opened his mouth and shut it again. The trap had been sprung. The prosecutor pressed on. And there's more. An internal review shows a disproportionate number of your traffic stops involved black drivers, a disturbing pattern that cannot be ignored. The murmurs grew louder, buzzing like hornets. Judge Kirkland set the file down and peered over his glasses. Sergeant Briggs, I don't like what I'm hearing. Briggs tried to salvage ground. She resisted. The prosecutor smiled coldly. Then let's play the footage. The lights dimmed, a screen lowered, and suddenly the room wasn't filled with words. It was filled with truth. Renee's calm voice, Briggs's escalating commands, the cuffs, the smirk. Every second of arrogance captured in pixels he couldn't erase. When the footage ended, the silence was different. Heavy, condemning. The kind of silence that destroys careers. The screen went black. The silence that followed was suffocating. You could hear a throat clear, a chair creak, the shuffle of someone shifting in their seat, but not a single word. The weight of that footage sat on the courtroom like a boulder, crushing every excuse Briggs had rehearsed in his head. Judge Kirkland leaned forward, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his voice low and deliberate. Sergeant Briggs, you violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest, and you omitted key details from your report. His gaze was sharp, surgical. This court does not tolerate officers who twist the law to serve their ego. Briggs opened his mouth, desperate, sweat beginning to purl at his temple. Your Honor, with respect, I was following standard. The gavel slammed once, cutting him off. The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson, the judge said firmly, are hereby dismissed. Another strike, and I strongly recommend an internal investigation into Sergeant Briggs's conduct. The words detonated in the room. The crowd murmured, some in disbelief, some in satisfaction. Renee exhaled, slow, steady, her eyes locked on Briggs. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat, she simply knew. Briggs looked like a man stripped bare, his face flushed crimson, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. He turned his head, avoiding the stares, the whispers, the burning weight of judgment. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one holding power. He was the one being measured, dissected, exposed. Reporters scribbled notes, court staff traded glances, even fellow officers shifted uncomfortably, the truth too glaring to deny. Briggs stormed out, his boots slamming against the floor, every step an echo of his crumbling authority. But the story didn't end there. The courthouse hallways are where reputations live or die. And as Briggs stalked toward the exit, a voice cut through the air like a whip. Sergeant Briggs! He froze. Chief Eldon Baker stood a few feet away, arms crossed, expression unreadable. 30 years on the force, a man whose word carried more weight than any badge. With me, the chief said too, earning toward a private office. Behind that closed door, the real reckoning began. The office door shut with a heavy click, muting the chaos of the courthouse hallway. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by the slant of daylight bleeding through half-closed blinds. Chief Eldon Baker didn't sit. He just stood there, staring at Briggs like a father who had run out of excuses for his son. Sit down, the chief ordered. Briggs obeyed, but not without that stubborn tilt of his chin, the one he wore like armor. His uniform still looked pressed, his badge still gleamed, but all of it was hollow now, costume instead of credibility. The chief took his time. He walked to the desk, set a thick file down, and tapped it once. Tap. The sound echoed in the stillness. You know what this is? Briggs shifted, uneasy. My record? No, Baker said, voice low. Your legacy. Every complaint, every stop questioned, every time you cut corners and thought no one noticed. It's all here. And today... He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Today it went public. Briggs' jaw flexed. "Chief, with respect, Dawson pushed me. She thought she was above the law. I was maintaining order." "Order?" The word snapped like a whip. "You embarrassed this department in front of a judge, a courtroom, and the press. You put every one of us under a microscope. And for what? A power trip on a decorated officer?" Briggs looked away, heat rising to his face. "She made me look weak." The chief slammed his palm on the desk, making the blinds rattle. "You made yourself look weak." His voice roared, then dropped to a gravelly whisper. "Real strength isn't about control, Briggs. It's about restraint, and you've never learned that." The silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. Briggs swallowed hard, the weight of truth pressing down on him for the first time. His swagger, his smirk, his shield of arrogance, it was cracking piece by piece. Finally, the chief straightened, pulling a paper from the file. "You're on suspension, effective immediately. Internal Affairs will finish the rest. Hand over your beat, badge, and your weapon." The words landed like a sentence. Briggs's hands shook as he unclipped the badge, setting it on the desk. The sound of it hitting wood was louder than any gavel, louder than any accusation. For the first time in his career, Sergeant Daniel Briggs wasn't in control. He was just another man in a room, stripped of the authority he thought made him untouchable. And outside that door, the world was already waiting to watch him fall. The hallway outside the chief's office buzzed with reporters, microphones angled like spears, cameras flashing with every movement. The rumor had already spread. Sergeant Briggs had been pulled into the chief's office, and everyone knew what that meant. When the door finally opened, Briggs stepped out. No badge on his chest, no weapon at his hip, just the uniform stripped of its weight. His face was pale, jaw tight, eyes darting to avoid the swarm waiting for him. But he couldn't avoid it. "Sergeant, are you suspended? Did you unlawfully arrest Commander Dawson? Do you target black drivers?" Questions fired like bullets. Briggs tried to push through, muttering no comment, but his voice cracked, brittle, betraying the storm inside. The cameras captured everything. His flushed cheeks, the sweat on his brow, the way his once confident stride faltered into a hurried retreat. And then, silence. Renee stepped into the hall, walking calmly past the chaos. Her blazer caught the light, her posture unshakable, her gaze forward. The crowd of reporters shifted instantly, microphones swinging toward her. "Commander Dawson, do you have a statement?" She stopped, turned, looked directly into the cameras. Her voice was steady, carrying the weight of someone who had faced far worse than this. "No one is above the law," she said simply, "and no one is beneath its protection." The words rippled through the room, cutting sharper than any headline. The rep, orders scribbled, the cameras zoomed in, and Renee turned back, walking toward the courthouse doors. Each step was quiet, but it thundered louder than Briggs' entire career. Behind her, Briggs stood frozen, suffocating in the storm he had created. His name would be tomorrow's headline, but not as a man of authority, as a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when arrogance collides with accountability. Outside, the sunlight hit Renee's face, free, vindicated. She drew a deep breath, the air cool and sharp in her lungs. Around her, the world kept moving, cars honking, people talking, life carrying on. But for her, this was the moment. Not of victory, not of revenge, but of truth. Because truth always finds a way out. And for Sergeant Briggs, the truth was the one opponent he could never beat. The courthouse steps were a battlefield of their own, lined with reporters, flashing bulbs, and voices rising like a storm. Renee descended slowly, each footstep deliberate, her face calm, almost serene. A handful of supporters cheered softly from the crowd, their signs held high. Justice for all. End biased policing. Across the plaza, Briggs lingered in the shadows near the exit, stripped of the shield that once made him untouchable. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands, though he hadn't smoked in years. Each drag was less about habit, more about survival. The crowd didn't look at him the way they once had. No respect, no nods of deference, only whispers, side eyes, and cameras waiting for his collapse. Inside, the courthouse press conference was just beginning. Chief Baker took the podium, his words steady but heavy. The department will not tolerate misconduct. Sergeant Briggs has been placed on suspension pending a full internal investigation. We are committed to accountability. Every syllable was another nail in Briggs's coffin. Meanwhile, Renee stood off to the side, away from the microphones, speaking quietly to a young girl who had tugged at her sleeve. The girl, no older than 12, whispered, "My brother was stopped once too. He was scared, but you weren't scared." Renee knelt, her voice soft. "I was scared," she admitted. "But courage isn't about never feeling fear. It's about standing tall anyway." The girl smiled faintly. For Renee, that moment meant more than any headline. As the crowd dispersed, two very different paths emerged. Renee walked toward a waiting car, the city ahead of her, her reputation intact and her dignity unbroken. Briggs walked the other way, down an empty side street, each step echoing in the hollow silence of his downfall. For Renee, this was not the end. It was a beginning, a reminder of what it meant to fight for fairness in a world that too often forgot it. For Briggs, it was the unraveling of a career, the long, dark road of a man forced to face what he had become. And in the end, the truth remained the only constant, unshakable, unrelenting, undefeated. 6 months later, the city had almost moved on. Headlines shifted to new scandals, new trials, new distractions, but some stories never truly faded. They just lived in whispers, in quiet reminders of what had been exposed. Sergeant Daniel Briggs was no longer Sergeant. Internal Affairs had finished its investigation. The findings were damning. A pattern of bias, excessive stops, falsified reports. His badge was gone for good. The union couldn't save him. Appeals went unanswered. Now he spent his days in a rundown apartment, blinds drawn, avoiding the eyes of neighbors who once nodded with respect. Occasionally, he'd catch his name online, in forums, in angry comments under articles, in think pieces about the fall of a cop who thought he was untouchable. His legacy wasn't medals or commendations. It was a cautionary tale. Renee Dawson, on the other hand, wore her uniform with renewed purpose. She had been promoted, her record cleared, her voice amplified. Universities invited her to speak. Community groups rallied around her. Young recruits at the Hone Academy looked to her as proof that integrity still mattered in a system too often marred by shadows. But Renee carried the experience not as a badge of victory, but as a scar. She knew the fight wasn't over. For every Briggs, there were others hiding behind paperwork and procedure. The difference now was that people were watching. The cameras, the public, the truth. They were no longer silent. One evening, Renee stood at the edge of a crowded auditorium, a spotlight warming her shoulders as she addressed the next generation of officers. "You will be tested," she told them. "Not just in the field, not just by criminals, but by the weight of your own power. And when that day comes, remember this. Strength isn't in how tightly you can hold control. Strength is in how fiercely you can protect justice." The room erupted in applause. Somewhere in the back, a young cadet whispered to another, "That's the kind of officer I want to be." And outside, beyond the walls of that hall, the city pulsed on, bruised, imperfect, but alive with the stubborn hope that truth, even when buried, even when denied, will always claw its way into the light. Because the story of Renee Dawson and Daniel Briggs wasn't just about one courtroom, it was about a reckoning that could never again be ignored.